Rain hammered the streets of downtown Chicago before sunrise. Fog rolled between glass towers like smoke from a forgotten war. Inside the underground garage of Meridian Crown Financial, engines echoed against concrete walls and polished black sedans slid into reserved executive spaces. Natalie Brooks adjusted the collar of her navy coat before stepping out of her aging silver Honda Accord. The car looked painfully ordinary beside the luxury vehicles surrounding it. A cold wind rushed through the garage entrance, carrying the scent of rain, gasoline, and expensive cologne. She picked up her leather briefcase carefully. Years of discipline shaped every movement she made. Calm, quiet, precise. Nobody looking at her would have guessed she controlled one of the largest private investment acquisitions in American history. A sharp voice cut through the garage. "Excuse me, that parking spot is reserved for executive leadership only." Natalie turned slowly. Victoria Langford approached with the confidence of someone born inside country clubs and private schools. Her ivory coat swayed behind her expensive heels. Gold earrings flashed beneath the fluorescent lights. 3 associates followed close behind, carrying tablets and coffee cups. Victoria stopped beside the Honda Accord and looked at Natalie with visible disgust. "Visitor parking is downstairs," she said coldly. "Employees are not allowed on this level unless authorized." Several executives slowed their pace nearby. They sensed entertainment before their morning meetings. Nobody interrupted. Natalie remained composed. "I parked where I was instructed to park," she replied quietly. Victoria laughed softly. "By who? Maintenance staff? Security?" One of the younger associates smirked while pretending not to watch. Natalie studied the woman carefully. Victoria Langford, senior legal partner at Langford & Pierce, one of the most influential corporate attorneys in Illinois. Natalie already knew everything about her. The garage security guard hurried toward them nervously. "Morning, Ms. Langford," he said quickly. Victoria pointed toward Natalie without taking her eyes away. "This woman somehow accessed executive parking. Please remove her before the board members arrive." The guard hesitated. "Ma'am, I should probably verify credentials first." "Obviously she doesn't belong here," Victoria snapped. "Look at the car." The words echoed across the concrete walls. A few executives exchanged uncomfortable glances but remained silent. Corporate America rewarded silence almost as much as ambition. Natalie's phone vibrated inside her coat pocket. She ignored it. Another message arrived immediately. "Board waiting upstairs," then another. "Media announcement confirmed." Natalie muted the device without reading further. Victoria crossed her arms. "You know," she continued loudly, performing now for the growing audience, "security problems usually begin with people pretending to belong somewhere they clearly don't belong." A younger employee near the elevator quietly started recording with her phone. Natalie noticed immediately, so did Victoria. Instead of calming down, Victoria straightened proudly. "This building houses billion-dollar negotiations," she announced. "We cannot allow random people wandering through executive areas pretending to matter." The security guard looked trapped. "Ma'am," he asked Natalie carefully, "could I please see your identification badge?" Natalie slowly reached inside her coat. Victoria stepped forward suddenly. "Before she shows you some fake badge," she interrupted, "you should understand how these scams work. People study executives online. They copy styles. They sneak inside buildings, hoping nobody questions them." Natalie's expression never changed. Rainwater dripped slowly from the ceiling pipes nearby. Somewhere above them, thunder rolled across Chicago. "People like you always think nobody notices," Victoria continued. The sentence hung heavily in the air. Nobody asked what she meant. Nobody needed clarification. Natalie finally spoke. "People like me?" Victoria smiled thinly. "You understand perfectly." And the young employee recording lowered her phone slightly, shocked by the directness. The elevator doors opened. 2 police officers stepped inside the garage beside building management. Someone had already called them. Officer Daniel Reyes approached calmly. "We received a report about trespassing," he said. Victoria immediately pointed toward Natalie. "This woman illegally entered executive parking and refuses to identify herself properly." Officer Reyes turned politely toward Natalie. "Ma'am, may I see some identification?" Natalie nodded once. She opened her briefcase slowly. Inside rested a black leather folder embossed with silver lettering. Meridian Crown Financial, Chief Executive Office. Victoria did not notice, neither did anyone else. Not yet. Natalie removed a simple driver's license first instead. Officer Reyes studied it beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting. His expression shifted slightly. "Gold Coast address," he murmured. Victoria scoffed immediately. "Anybody can rent an apartment temporarily. That proves absolutely nothing." Natalie quietly watched her continue digging deeper into disaster. A black SUV entered the garage suddenly. Every executive turned. The vehicle stopped near the elevators. A tall, older man stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat. Richard Holloway, chairman of Meridian Crown Financial's board. The entire atmosphere changed instantly. Executives straightened their posture automatically. Victoria smiled with relief. "Mr. Holloway," she called confidently. "Thank goodness. Security found an unauthorized woman occupying executive parking." Richard Holloway looked toward Natalie, then toward Victoria, then back toward Natalie again. His face hardened immediately. A long silence followed. Rain pounded harder outside. Finally, Richard spoke. "Victoria," he said carefully, "do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" The garage fell completely silent. Even the ventilation system sounded louder suddenly. Victoria blinked in confusion while Richard Holloway walked directly toward Natalie without acknowledging anyone else nearby. His polished shoes echoed sharply against the concrete floor. Then, to everyone's disbelief, the chairman of Meridian Crown Financial extended his hand respectfully. "Good morning, Ms. Carter," he said warmly. "The board has been waiting upstairs for 20 minutes." And the world seemed to stop around Victoria Langford. Natalie shook his hand calmly. "Traffic was difficult," she replied softly. Richard gave a small glance toward Victoria. Apparently, other obstacles appeared as well. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Officer Reyes looked between them carefully. "Sir," he asked cautiously, "this woman is authorized to be here?" Richard turned slowly. "Authorized," he repeated. "Officer, this woman owns 51% of Meridian Crown Financial." The words exploded across the garage. Several executives physically stepped backward. One associate nearly dropped her coffee cup. Victoria's expression emptied completely. "No," she whispered automatically. Richard continued. "Natalie Carter founded Meridian Crown 12 years ago after the recession destroyed her father's manufacturing company in Detroit. Today, she oversees operations in 7 states and controls nearly $9 billion in managed assets." The younger employee recording lowered her phone slowly. Her livestream viewer count had already passed 30,000. Comments flooded endlessly. Victoria stared at Natalie like she had transformed into someone else entirely. "That's impossible," she said weakly. "I know every executive at Meridian." Natalie finally looked directly into her eyes. "No," she replied quietly. "You know every executive who looks familiar to you." The sentence landed harder than shouting ever could. Richard folded his hands behind his back. "Ms. Carter intentionally avoids publicity," he explained calmly. "She prefers evaluating environments personally instead of hiding behind assistants and press teams." Victoria's breathing became uneven. "There must be some misunderstanding," she stammered quickly. "I was only protecting building security." Officer Reyes looked uncomfortable now. The security guard looked terrified. Natalie remained composed. "Did security require verification from everyone entering this garage today?" she asked quietly. Nobody answered. "Or only me?" The question floated heavily through the garage. Richard's expression darkened further. Victoria attempted another smile. "Ms. Carter, if there has been some unfortunate confusion, I apologize. These situations happen quickly." Natalie tilted her head slightly. "You accused me of trespassing." Victoria swallowed. "A misunderstanding. You suggested I was dangerous. I was concerned about security. You implied I was incapable of holding executive authority because of how I looked." Victoria's face drained pale. Nobody came to her defense now. Corporate loyalty disappeared quickly when power changed direction. Richard looked toward the assembled executives. Interesting how silent this room became, he observed. Nobody met his eyes. Natalie slowly closed her briefcase. This morning was important to me, she said softly. Not because of the board meeting upstairs. Rain streaked down the garage entrance behind her. Chicago's skyline remained hidden beneath dark storm clouds. Today, Meridian finalizes the largest acquisition in company history, Natalie continued, a transaction designed to reshape corporate culture across every company connected to our network. Victoria looked confused. Richard almost smiled. Ms. Langford, he said carefully, perhaps you should know exactly why Ms. Carter arrived here personally this morning. Natalie reached into her briefcase again. This time, she removed a thick legal document folder. Silver lettering reflected beneath the fluorescent lights. Acquisition Agreement, Langford and Pierce Legal Group. Victoria stopped breathing. The folder slipped from Natalie's hand deliberately onto the hood of the Honda Accord. The sound echoed like a gunshot. At midnight, Natalie said calmly, Meridian Crown officially acquired Langford and Pierce. Nobody moved. Victoria stared at the documents in horror. No, she whispered. Richard nodded once. Your firm's partners accepted the offer unanimously yesterday evening. Victoria looked physically ill. Her entire career suddenly shifted beneath her feet like collapsing ice. The law firm she spent 16 years climbing through. The position she sacrificed marriages and friendships to protect. The company now belonged to the woman she publicly humiliated 15 minutes earlier. One associate quietly backed away toward the elevators. Another stared at the floor. Nobody wanted cameras capturing their faces anymore. Natalie watched Victoria carefully. Not cruelly, not triumphantly, simply observantly. Do you know why I chose your firm? Natalie asked. Victoria remained silent. Because your attorneys are brilliant, Natalie answered herself. Your litigation record is exceptional. Your negotiation teams outperform almost everyone nationally. She paused. But your internal culture is poison. The sentence cut deeper than anger. Richard folded his arms. Over the past 5 years, he added, Langford and Pierce lost 23 female associates and 11 minority attorneys despite excellent performance reviews. Natalie's voice stayed calm. We investigated quietly before the acquisition. Exit interviews revealed patterns of discrimination, exclusion, and intimidation. Victoria's lips trembled. I never. You built your authority on fear, Natalie interrupted gently. People around you learned silence was safer than honesty. The young employee recording looked visibly emotional now. Thousands online were watching in absolute silence. Victoria glanced desperately toward the other executives. Nobody helped her, because many recognized themselves inside the accusation. Natalie stepped closer. You looked at my car before my credentials, she said softly. My skin before my qualifications. My appearance before my authority. Victoria lowered her eyes. And the worst part, Natalie continued, is that nobody here was surprised. The statement shattered whatever comfort remained inside the garage. Officer Reyes quietly removed his notepad. Even he understood now, this was no longer about parking. This was about an entire system finally being dragged into daylight. Richard checked his watch. The board meeting cannot wait much longer, he said carefully. Natalie nodded. Then she looked back toward Victoria one final time. Come upstairs, she said quietly. Victoria blinked in shock. Why would I? Because what happens next will determine whether your career ends today, Natalie replied, or whether your life actually begins. The executive elevator climbed silently toward the 48th floor. Nobody spoke. Victoria stood near the back corner beside 2 associates who suddenly refused eye contact. The mirrored walls reflected her pale expression from every angle. For the first time in years, she looked uncertain inside a corporate building. Natalie stood calmly near the front beside Richard Holloway. Rain streaked across the glass exterior as Chicago disappeared beneath dark clouds outside. The elevator doors opened. The boardroom stretched across nearly half the floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Michigan and the sleeping city below. Long walnut tables reflected soft golden lighting. Coffee steamed beside digital tablets and thick financial reports. 27 board members and senior executives turned simultaneously. Then every person in the room stood immediately. Good morning, Ms. Carter, several voices said together. Victoria froze beside the doorway. The room treated Natalie with absolute respect. Not fear, not performance, genuine respect. Natalie walked toward the head of the table naturally. The chair waiting there remained empty for only her. Richard sat quietly beside her while executives resumed their seats carefully. Victoria remained standing awkwardly near the entrance. Natalie noticed. "Sit down," she said calmly. Victoria hesitated before taking the furthest chair possible. The distance did not help. Every eye in the room occasionally drifted toward her. Natalie opened a thin black folder. Before discussing today's acquisition, she began evenly, "We need to address something more important than revenue." A presentation appeared across the massive digital screen. Corporate attrition data, diversity loss metrics, executive culture reports. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Several executives straightened uneasily. Natalie clicked the remote once. Photographs appeared. Young attorneys, financial analysts, managers, consultants, mostly women, mostly minorities. "These are former employees from companies connected to Meridian Crown," Natalie explained quietly. "Exceptional professionals who left industries they once loved." Another click. Testimonies appeared, mistaken for assistants, excluded from negotiations, denied promotions, humiliated publicly, ignored repeatedly. The room stayed silent. Victoria slowly lowered her eyes. 3 years ago, Natalie continued, a brilliant attorney named Danielle Brooks resigned after a senior partner asked whether clients would feel safer with someone less intimidating handling negotiations. She paused. Danielle graduated first in her class at Northwestern Law. Another photograph appeared. Marcus Reed left investment banking after repeatedly being mistaken for security staff during executive meetings. Another click. Sofia Alvarez abandoned corporate litigation after partners excluded her from major accounts despite outperforming senior associates for 4 consecutive years. Natalie's voice remained controlled. That somehow made everything worse. "Every one of these people represented millions in lost talent," she said, "not because they lacked ability, because systems rewarded prejudice disguised as professionalism." Richard leaned forward. "Most corporations treat discrimination as a public relations problem," he added. "Meridian now considers it a financial liability." The screen changed again. A number appeared, $412,000. Several executives blinked. "Estimated losses across our network during the last 7 years, Natalie explained. Lawsuits, resignations, recruitment failures, innovation collapse, client distrust. Nobody touched their coffee anymore. The room felt heavier now. Natalie looked directly toward Victoria. "This morning in the garage was not unusual," she said softly. "That is the real problem." Victoria swallowed hard. One older executive cleared his throat carefully. "Ms. Carter," he began cautiously, "surely today's incident should remain private. Public exposure could damage every company involved." Natalie studied him quietly. "Damage already exists," she replied. "Exposure simply forces people to acknowledge it." Another executive shifted nervously. "Social media is already circulating clips," he admitted. Richard almost smiled. 3 million views in 40 minutes, he said. Several phones vibrated simultaneously around the table. Breaking news alerts, Chicago financial scandal, trending nationally. Victoria looked physically ill now. Natalie noticed again. Still no cruelty entered her expression, only disappointment. "Today is not about revenge," Natalie said quietly. "If I wanted revenge, lawyers would already be waiting outside this room." Nobody doubted her. "This is about transformation," she continued, "because systems survive when good people remain silent around bad behavior." Her eyes moved slowly around the table. Several executives looked away immediately. They understood the accusation. The silence inside the garage had condemned more than Victoria alone. Natalie changed slides again. Meridian Executive Reform Initiative. The title filled the screen. "Starting today," Natalie announced, "every company connected to Meridian Crown will adopt mandatory equity oversight protocols, independent audits, promotion transparency, bias accountability reviews, leadership certification standards." A younger board member frowned. "Mandatory? Yes, Natalie answered calmly. And companies refusing participation? Richard answered this time. We'll lose Meridian partnership access immediately. Silence returned. The room understood the implications instantly. Meridian controlled billions in financial relationships. Nobody wanted exclusion. Victoria finally spoke quietly. You're restructuring an entire industry because of one parking garage incident? Natalie looked at her carefully. No, she replied. The garage incident simply revealed what already existed beneath polished surfaces. Another silence, heavy, unavoidable. Outside the windows, thunder rolled across Lake Michigan. Chicago disappeared deeper beneath rain. Then the boardroom doors opened unexpectedly. A young assistant entered nervously holding a tablet. Ms. Carter, she said carefully, national media outlets are requesting statements. CNN, Bloomberg, CNBC, The Wall Street Journal. The room stirred anxiously. Natalie remained calm. Any response from Langford and Pierce? She asked. The assistant hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. She turned the tablet screen toward the room. A headline filled the display. Langford and Pierce announces internal review following discrimination controversy. Victoria stared at the screen in horror. Then another notification appeared beneath it. Emergency partner vote initiated. Her own firm had already begun separating itself from her publicly, and Natalie Carter had not even started the real meeting yet. Victoria's phone would not stop vibrating. Messages flooded endlessly across the screen. Partners, clients, reporters, board members. Nobody asked whether the story was true. Everyone had already seen the videos. The boardroom remained silent while rain battered the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Television screens mounted along the walls quietly displayed financial news channels now discussing Meridian Crown Financial. One headline repeated constantly: CEO exposes corporate discrimination during viral confrontation. Victoria could barely breathe. Natalie continued reviewing acquisition documents as if nothing unusual had happened. That calmness unsettled everyone more than anger would have. Let's proceed, Natalie said quietly. The digital screen shifted again. Projected quarterly growth estimates appeared. Revenue charts, expansion maps, acquisition forecasts. The board attempted returning to normal business discussion. Nobody truly succeeded because Victoria sat there like a visible warning. An example, a mirror. Richard Holloway leaned back thoughtfully. The Memphis expansion remains our highest priority, he said. Natalie nodded. And Detroit redevelopment financing moves forward next month. One executive cleared his throat carefully. Natalie, he asked quietly, should legal prepare for lawsuits following this morning? Victoria visibly flinched. Natalie looked toward the rain-covered skyline. Probably, she admitted calmly. Several executives shifted nervously. Against Victoria personally? Natalie turned back slowly. Against systems, she corrected. The answer surprised them. Most people expected destruction from powerful individuals after public humiliation. Natalie kept choosing something harder. Control. Another alert flashed across the wall television. Former employees speak out about Langford and Pierce culture. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. More stories were emerging now. Former associates, former interns, anonymous testimonies. The internet had opened floodgates impossible to close. Natalie noticed the television. This is why silence becomes expensive, she said softly. Nobody argued. A younger executive named Daniel Mercer leaned forward. Ms. Carter, he asked carefully, how long have you known about conditions inside Langford and Pierce? Natalie folded her hands. Almost 2 years. Victoria looked up sharply. 2 years? Natalie nodded. We investigated quietly after noticing unusual turnover among minority associates connected to your firm. Richard added calmly, your litigation performance remained exceptional, but internally patterns became impossible to ignore. Victoria stared downward again, the humiliation cut deeper because portions were undeniably true. Natalie clicked another slide. Confidential exit summaries. Anonymous statements appeared. Excluded from client dinners, ignored during strategy meetings, mistaken for support staff, encouraged to sound less ethnic. The room became painfully still. Several older executives looked deeply uncomfortable because many remembered hearing similar language before, maybe even using it. Natalie spoke carefully. Discrimination rarely begins with screaming hatred. Her voice stayed calm and measured. Usually it begins with assumptions, with small humiliations repeated until talented people disappear quietly. Victoria swallowed hard. The garage confrontation replayed endlessly inside her mind now. The Honda Accord, the comments, the confidence, the certainty that she could immediately recognize who belonged. Natalie studied her silently. Then something unexpected happened. "Victoria," Natalie said gently. The room looked toward them both. "Tell me honestly." Victoria hesitated. "What?" Natalie's expression remained unreadable. "If I stepped out of a black Mercedes wearing a different face this morning, would security have been called?" The question struck harder than any accusation yet, because everyone already knew the answer. Victoria's lips trembled. No words emerged. Natalie nodded slightly. "Exactly." A heavy silence settled over the boardroom again, then another interruption arrived. The assistant returned hurriedly carrying fresh documents. Her nervousness was obvious. "Ms. Carter," she said carefully, "3 major clients have suspended legal contracts with Langford and Pierce within the last 15 minutes. Victoria's breathing quickened. "Which clients?" she asked weakly. The assistant looked uncomfortable. "Blue Lake Energy, Harrison Medical Systems, and First Union Logistics." Those names hit like artillery shells. Combined annual billing exceeded $80 million. One associate near Victoria quietly cursed beneath his breath. Natalie remained perfectly calm. "Reason given?" Richard asked. The assistant hesitated, then quietly answered, "Concerns regarding discriminatory workplace culture and reputational liability." Nobody spoke. Outside the windows, lightning flashed across Chicago. Victoria looked smaller somehow. Less powerful, less untouchable. Daniel Mercer exhaled slowly. "This industry changes fast," he muttered. Natalie looked toward him. "No," she replied quietly. "This industry stayed unchanged too long." The statement lingered heavily. Another executive finally spoke. "What exactly happens now to Langford and Pierce?" Natalie opened another document calmly. "Complete restructuring, independent oversight, leadership review, cultural compliance auditing." Victoria stared blankly ahead. "And me?" Natalie met her eyes. The room seemed to tighten around the moment. "That depends entirely on what happens next," Natalie answered. Victoria frowned weakly. Natalie stood slowly from her chair. "You still believe this morning happened because you made one mistake," she said softly. Nobody moved. "But mistakes happen accidentally." Her eyes remained locked on Victoria. "You believed every word you said in that garage." The truth landed brutally. Victoria could not deny it, because she remembered the certainty in her own voice, the confidence, the superiority. Natalie walked slowly toward the windows overlooking Chicago. Rain blurred the skyline into gray shadows. "The real question," Natalie continued quietly, "is whether people can change once they finally see themselves clearly." Nobody interrupted. Victoria's eyes slowly filled with tears she clearly fought desperately to hide. Then her phone rang again. This time she answered automatically. A man's voice exploded loudly enough for nearby executives to hear. "Victoria, the partners voted unanimously. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending investigation." The line disconnected. Victoria lowered the phone slowly. Her hands shook visibly now. Natalie turned from the windows, and for the first time that morning, genuine sadness crossed her face. Because the woman collapsing before them was not simply losing a job, she was losing the identity she built her entire life around. Victoria sat motionless after the call ended. Nobody in the boardroom spoke. The silence carried the weight of witnessing a professional collapse in real time. Outside, rain still hammered against the skyscraper windows overlooking Chicago. Gray clouds buried the city beneath shadows, while morning traffic crawled like insects across distant streets. Natalie returned slowly to the head of the table. Her expression remained composed, not victorious, not satisfied, simply tired. Richard Holloway studied Victoria carefully. 16 years, he said quietly, gone in one morning. Victoria laughed weakly. The sound broke halfway through. "No," she whispered. "It started disappearing years ago. I just never noticed." That honesty changed the room slightly. Executives who viewed her as a villain moments earlier now saw something more complicated. A person shaped by a brutal culture until cruelty felt normal. Natalie noticed the shift immediately. "Corporate environments teach survival before morality," she said softly, "especially for ambitious people." Several executives avoided eye contact. They understood exactly what she meant. The boardroom doors opened again. Two legal assistants entered, carrying additional files. One handed documents directly to Natalie. "Preliminary media response drafts," she explained quietly. Natalie skimmed the pages briefly, then closed the folder without signing anything. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Problems?" Natalie nodded. "Too defensive." One executive looked confused. "Defensive? The company needs damage control immediately." Natalie turned toward him. "Damage control is how corporations hide problems instead of solving them." The room fell silent again. She slid the unsigned statements aside. "We are not denying what happened," Natalie continued. "We are acknowledging it publicly and explaining exactly how Meridian intends to change these systems permanently." Daniel Mercer leaned forward. "That level of transparency could destroy investor confidence." Natalie almost smiled. "Or strengthen it." Nobody answered immediately, because nobody in that room had ever seen leadership handled this way before. Most executives protected institutions first. Natalie protected truth first, and somehow that frightened them more. Victoria suddenly spoke quietly. "You planned all this before the garage, didn't you?" Natalie looked toward her calmly. "The acquisition?" "Yes." "No," Victoria whispered. "The reform initiative. The oversight systems. The audits." Natalie folded her hands together. 3 years ago, a young analyst named Jerome Ellis killed himself in Cleveland. The room immediately stilled. Nobody expected that answer. Natalie's voice softened. "He worked 80-hour weeks while enduring constant humiliation from supervisors who treated him like a diversity statistic instead of a person." Nobody interrupted. "His mother sent me a letter after the funeral," Natalie continued. "She asked one question I could never stop thinking about." Natalie paused briefly. How many talented people must break before powerful people finally admit these environments are toxic? Even the air inside the boardroom felt heavier now. Victoria lowered her eyes again. Richard exhaled quietly. He had heard this story before. The others had not. "That letter changed everything," Natalie said. "I realized corporations spend billions studying productivity while ignoring human damage directly connected to leadership culture." One older executive removed his glasses slowly. His face looked exhausted suddenly. "My daughter quit finance after 2 years," he admitted quietly. "She said the culture made her feel invisible." Nobody mocked him. Another executive nodded slowly. "My son left corporate law for similar reasons." The atmosphere shifted again. This was no longer abstract policy discussion. Now it felt personal, human. Victoria stared blankly at the polished conference table, then finally whispered something almost nobody heard. "My daughter stopped wanting to visit my office years ago." Natalie heard it. So did Richard. The sentence hung quietly in the room. A confession more painful than public humiliation. Natalie walked slowly around the table, then stopped beside Victoria. "What's her name?" she asked gently. Victoria hesitated. "Emma." "How old?" 13. Natalie nodded slowly. "Old enough to notice who her mother becomes at work." Victoria closed her eyes. Tears slipped silently down her face now. Nobody looked away. Nobody rushed to comfort her either. Some moments required honesty more than rescue. Richard cleared his throat carefully. "Natalie," he said quietly, "we still need a formal decision regarding Victoria's employment status before markets open." Everyone looked toward Natalie. The entire room waited. Victoria remained perfectly still, like someone awaiting sentencing. Natalie returned to the head of the table slowly. She opened another folder. Inside rested formal termination papers. Nobody missed them. Victoria certainly did not. Natalie studied the documents for several seconds, then unexpectedly closed the folder again. A few executives blinked in surprise. No immediate termination, Natalie announced calmly. Victoria looked up sharply. Richard looked genuinely surprised. Natalie, he began cautiously. She raised one hand gently. Punishment alone changes nothing, she said. Then she looked directly at Victoria. But accountability matters. The room remained frozen. Natalie opened another document instead, Executive Rehabilitation and Leadership Reform Program. Victoria frowned weakly. Natalie spoke carefully. Mandatory suspension, mandatory public accountability statement, mandatory leadership retraining under independent oversight. Daniel Mercer looked stunned. You're offering rehabilitation? Natalie nodded once. Because people shaped by broken systems often become the most effective voices against them once they finally understand the damage they caused. Victoria stared at her in disbelief. After everything I said to you, Natalie's expression remained calm, especially after everything you said. Nobody expected mercy. That was precisely why it carried such enormous weight. Outside the windows, thunder rolled across Chicago again. Then the assistant hurried back into the room one final time. This time her face looked pale. Ms. Carter, she said nervously, there's another issue developing online. Natalie frowned slightly. What issue? The assistant swallowed hard. Former employees are now identifying other executives visible in the garage footage. Silence. Terrible silence. Slowly, several executives around the table realized the scandal was no longer focused solely on Victoria Langford. The spotlight was beginning to widen. Fear spread quietly around the boardroom. Not panic, something colder. Recognition. Several executives immediately reached for their phones while avoiding eye contact with one another. Notifications flashed endlessly across screens. Former employees identifying discriminatory behavior. Anonymous testimonies. Old stories resurfacing publicly. The garage confrontation had cracked open something much larger than a single viral incident. Natalie remained seated calmly at the head of the table. She watched powerful people suddenly experience the same uncertainty many employees lived with daily. Richard Holloway folded his arms thoughtfully. Interesting, he murmured. Nobody answered. The assistant nervously adjusted her tablet. One former analyst identified Daniel Mercer, she said carefully. Daniel immediately looked pale. What? The assistant swallowed. She claims you repeatedly excluded female associates from client presentations while assigning them administrative work. Daniel opened his mouth quickly. That's completely distorted. Natalie quietly observed him. Is it inaccurate, she asked calmly, or uncomfortable? The question landed brutally. Daniel hesitated too long. Everyone noticed. Another executive shifted nervously, then another alert appeared. A healthcare executive near the windows suddenly removed his glasses. Jesus Christ, he whispered. Richard looked toward him. Problem? The man exhaled heavily. A former employee just posted internal emails from 3 years ago. Nobody needed further explanation. The room understood exactly where this was heading. Natalie spoke softly. This is why toxic cultures survive for decades. Rain continued hammering the windows. Chicago looked darker now beneath the storm. People believe silence protects them, Natalie continued, until silence finally becomes more dangerous than honesty. Victoria remained quiet beside the wall. Her humiliation no longer felt isolated. The entire corporate ecosystem surrounding Meridian Crown suddenly appeared fragile, exposed. Richard leaned back slowly. The media narrative shifted faster than expected, he admitted. Natalie nodded, because millions of people recognized familiar behavior immediately. Nobody argued. That was the terrifying truth. The garage footage spread nationally because viewers saw their own workplaces inside it. Their own managers. Their own humiliations. Their own silence. Natalie stood slowly. Every conversation stopped immediately. Listen carefully, she said. The room obeyed instantly. Today is not a scandal. Several executives looked confused. Natalie's voice remained steady. Scandals disappear after headlines fade. This is structural exposure. The distinction mattered. Richard watched her carefully. He already understood where she was going. Every executive inside this room now faces a choice, Natalie continued. Defend old systems and collapse with them, or help build something better before markets force change anyway. Daniel Mercer rubbed his forehead anxiously. Investors will panic if this expands further. Natalie almost smiled. Investors panic when leadership appears dishonest. Transparency stabilizes markets faster than concealment ever does. When one older board member shook his head slowly, "You really believe companies can fundamentally change?" Natalie looked toward the rain-covered skyline. "I believe survival forces adaptation eventually." Then she turned back. "The only question is whether leadership changes willingly or publicly collapses first." Nobody missed the warning. The assistant's tablet buzzed again. Her eyes widened. "Ms. Carter," she said carefully, "Bloomberg wants a live interview immediately." Richard frowned. "Already?" The assistant nodded. "Every network wants statements now." Natalie considered quietly for several seconds, then surprised everyone again. "Schedule it," she said. Daniel Mercer looked stunned. "Now? While this situation keeps escalating?" Natalie nodded calmly. "Exactly now." Richard smiled faintly. He finally understood the full strategy. Natalie was not trying to survive the story. She intended to control its meaning. Victoria slowly lifted her head. "You really aren't afraid," she whispered. Natalie looked toward her thoughtfully. "I spent 20 years navigating rooms where people questioned whether I belonged before hearing me speak," she replied quietly. "Fear becomes exhausting eventually." The honesty silenced the room again. Natalie walked slowly toward the windows. Lightning flashed across Lake Michigan. For a moment, her reflection appeared against the storm-dark glass. Powerful, controlled, lonely. "When I started Meridian," she said softly, "banks rejected my proposals 14 times. Investors asked whether clients would trust a young black woman managing major acquisitions. Nobody interrupted. One executive suggested I focus on diversity consulting instead of finance because it looked more appropriate." Victoria lowered her eyes again. She heard her own language reflected back differently now. Natalie continued, "The problem with discrimination isn't simply cruelty." Her voice remained calm. "It's inefficiency, stupidity. Businesses repeatedly destroy talent because insecure people confuse familiarity with competence." Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Because the statement was financially undeniable, Natalie turned back toward the room. This morning exposed more than prejudice. It exposed weak leadership hiding behind status symbols and assumptions. Nobody defended themselves. Then another notification arrived. The assistant looked nervous again. "There's one more development," she said quietly. Richard frowned. "What now?" The assistant hesitated, then answered carefully. "Former employees are organizing publicly online." Natalie watched her closely. "Organizing how?" The assistant swallowed hard. "They're calling for a nationwide corporate accountability coalition." The room went completely silent, because suddenly everyone understood. The garage incident was no longer just a viral story. It was becoming a movement. By noon, the story dominated every major news network in America. Split screens showed the underground garage footage beside financial analysts discussing corporate discrimination and executive accountability. Hashtags flooded social media platforms faster than moderators could track them. Hashtag who belongs here, Meridian movement. Yamase. Corporate truth inside Meridian Crown. Financial, the atmosphere transformed completely. Phones rang endlessly. Legal teams rushed between offices. Public relations advisors looked exhausted already. But Natalie Carter remained calm. She sat alone briefly inside her private office, overlooking Chicago's rain-soaked skyline, while television screens silently replayed the garage confrontation. Victoria's voice echoed repeatedly. "People like you." Natalie muted the screen. The phrase felt older than the building itself, older than Wall Street, older than America. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Richard Holloway entered carrying coffee. "You should probably eat something," he said quietly. Natalie smiled faintly. "I forgot breakfast existed." Richard handed her a cup. "Markets haven't collapsed yet. That's encouraging." Natalie looked toward the windows. Not yet, she replied. Richard studied her carefully. You expected resistance. Of course. But this, Natalie finally turned toward him. Honestly, I expected fear. I underestimated how many people were waiting for permission to speak publicly. Richard nodded slowly. The internet had become impossible to control now. Former employees across finance, law, healthcare, and consulting industries were sharing stories faster than corporations could respond. Not all involved Meridian. That no longer mattered. The garage confrontation became symbolic. A trigger. An opening. Natalie's assistant entered quickly. The Bloomberg interview begins in 10 minutes, she said nervously. Richard stood immediately. Ready? Natalie looked toward the muted television again. Victoria's frozen expression remained visible on screen. No, Natalie admitted softly. Then she stood anyway. The live interview studio occupied the 39th floor. Bright lights illuminated minimalist furniture while producers rushed around adjusting cameras and microphones. Through glass walls, reporters filled nearby hallways, waiting for statements. Natalie entered without hesitation. Across from her sat Diane Keller, one of the most respected financial journalists in America. Diane adjusted her notes carefully. Thank you for joining us during an obviously difficult day, she began. Natalie nodded politely. Thank you for having me. The countdown began. 5, 4, 3. Red studio lights illuminated instantly. America was watching. Good afternoon, Diane began smoothly. Today, the business world witnessed shocking footage involving Meridian Crown Financial CEO Natalie Carter and attorney Victoria Langford. Ms. Carter, millions have now seen this confrontation. What exactly happened this morning? Natalie answered immediately. What happened this morning happens quietly inside corporate America every day. The control room fell silent. Diane blinked slightly. Natalie continued calmly. The only unusual part was that cameras captured it publicly. Across the country, viewers leaned closer toward screens. Natalie did not sound angry. That made her impossible to dismiss. Diane adjusted carefully. Some critics argue the public exposure unfairly destroyed Victoria Langford's career within hours. Natalie folded her hands. Careers rarely collapse because of one moment, she replied quietly. They collapse when private behavior finally becomes visible publicly. Inside the boardroom upstairs, executives watched nervously. Victoria watched too. Alone. She sat inside a temporary office provided by Meridian's legal department while national television dissected the worst morning of her life. Natalie's voice echoed softly through the room. This conversation cannot remain about one woman, she said on screen, because focusing entirely on Victoria allows systems to avoid accountability again. Victoria stared silently. Something painful moved behind her expression, understanding. Back inside the studio, Diane leaned forward. So what happens next? Natalie answered without hesitation. Transformation. The word hung powerfully in the air. Meridian Crown is launching mandatory equity accountability standards across every connected company in our network. Independent oversight, promotion transparency, leadership certification reforms. Diane looked surprised. You're restructuring entire corporate partnerships because of this incident? Natalie shook her head calmly. No, we are restructuring because this incident revealed the truth about systems already failing thousands of talented people quietly. Phones exploded across Wall Street. Executives watched in stunned silence nationwide. Natalie was not apologizing. She was redefining the conversation entirely. Diane hesitated before asking the question everyone expected. And Victoria Langford personally? Natalie paused briefly, then answered carefully. I believe accountability without transformation is just theater. The statement spread online instantly. Millions reposted the clip within minutes. Natalie continued, people can change if systems stop rewarding their worst instincts. Upstairs, Victoria covered her mouth suddenly. Tears filled her eyes again, because Natalie Carter still refused to destroy her publicly. Even now, Diane lowered her notes slowly. Ms. Carter, she asked quietly, why show mercy after everything that happened? Natalie looked directly into the camera. The entire country seemed to hold its breath. Because humiliation creates fear, she said softly, but understanding creates change. Silence filled the studio, then Natalie added something nobody expected. And because I know exactly what it feels like to become hardened by systems designed around survival instead of humanity. Even Diane looked emotional suddenly. The interview ended moments later. But one final clip already dominated social media before cameras shut down. Natalie Carter looking directly into America and saying, "The question is not whether discrimination exists. The question is how many profitable institutions secretly depend on it." And somewhere inside Meridian Crown Financial, several executives realized they might not survive the answer. The interview changed everything. By mid-afternoon, clips of Natalie Carter's statements flooded every major platform online. Universities analyzed her comments in business ethics classes before the workday even ended. Financial analysts debated whether Meridian Crown had triggered the beginning of a permanent corporate restructuring movement. Inside Chicago's financial district, executives moved differently now. More cautiously, more nervously. Every hallway conversation suddenly carried invisible risk. Every assistant watching quietly from the corner might possess recordings. Every former employee might finally decide to speak. At Meridian headquarters, Natalie walked through the executive floor without security for the first time all day. People stopped talking when she passed. Not from fear alone, from reflection. Some employees looked inspired, others looked terrified. Most looked uncertain. Natalie understood all three reactions. Her assistant hurried beside her, carrying 2 tablets and a stack of printed reports. "The coalition website crashed twice already," she said breathlessly. Over 200,000 workplace testimonies submitted nationally within 3 hours. Natalie slowed slightly. "How many verified?" "Enough," the assistant answered quietly. That single word carried enormous weight. Natalie entered a smaller conference room overlooking the river. Richard Holloway waited beside the windows, speaking with 3 board members from New York through video screens. The moment Natalie entered, conversation stopped. One grey-haired investor immediately leaned forward. "Natalie, this situation is escalating globally now. London financial firms are responding publicly. Toronto too." Natalie sat calmly. "Good." The board members exchanged uncertain looks. Richard almost smiled. "She means transparency spreads faster internationally than traditional corporate containment strategies." One investor rubbed his forehead anxiously. "Investors hate instability." Natalie folded her hands. "No," she corrected quietly. "Investors hate uncertainty." The distinction mattered. "Clear reform creates confidence," she continued. "Hidden corruption creates collapse once exposure becomes unavoidable." Nobody answered immediately, because recent history supported her argument. Every major corporate scandal worsened through concealment. The assistant's tablet buzzed again, her face tightened. "Another development," she said carefully. Natalie nodded. "Go ahead." Employees inside several partner companies are demanding leadership reviews publicly. Silence settled across the room. One board member whispered quietly, "Jesus Christ." Natalie remained calm. Richard watched her thoughtfully. "You expected this too," he realized. Natalie looked toward the river below. When people finally see powerful systems challenged successfully, fear weakens quickly. Outside, rain finally began slowing. Grey afternoon light spread weakly across Chicago. Then another notification appeared. The assistant hesitated visibly this time. "Natalie," she said quietly, "there's something else you should probably see personally." She handed over the tablet. A new video filled the screen. Victoria Langford, recorded minutes earlier. She sat alone inside Meridian's temporary office, visibly exhausted but composed enough to speak directly into the camera. Everyone in the room watched silently. Victoria inhaled slowly before beginning. "This morning, millions watched me humiliate another human being because I believed status mattered more than dignity." Natalie's expression did not change. Richard folded his arms thoughtfully. Victoria continued, "I told myself for years that aggressive behavior meant professional excellence. I confused intimidation with authority and prejudice with instinct." The room remained perfectly still. "The worst part is this," Victoria admitted quietly. Nothing I said felt shocking to me while I said it. That honesty hit harder than denial ever could. Victoria looked directly into the camera. Many executives watching this recognize exactly what I mean. One investor slowly removed his glasses. Nobody spoke. Victoria's voice trembled slightly now. I spent years becoming the kind of person my younger self would fear. Natalie lowered the tablet slightly. Something painful flickered behind her eyes. Not pity. Recognition, Victoria continued. Natalie Carter showed me more mercy today than I showed her this morning. I don't deserve that grace yet, but I intend to earn it. The video ended. Silence lingered heavily afterward. Finally, Richard spoke. That changes things. Natalie nodded slowly. Maybe. The assistant looked emotional now. The video already has 8 million views, she whispered. Another board member leaned back heavily. This stopped being business news hours ago, he murmured. Natalie stood slowly from her chair. Everyone watched her. No, she replied softly. This became human the moment people recognized themselves inside it. The room fell silent again. Then the conference room doors opened suddenly. A security director entered quickly. His face looked tense. Ms. Carter, he said urgently, there are protesters gathering outside the building. Several executives immediately stiffened. Against Meridian? One investor asked sharply. The security director hesitated, then answered carefully. No, ma'am. He looked directly at Natalie. They're supporting you. Natalie frowned slightly. The director continued. Employees from other companies are joining too, hundreds already, more arriving every minute. Richard walked toward the windows quickly. Far below, crowds filled the sidewalks around Meridian Tower. Umbrellas covered entire streets beneath fading rain. Handmade signs lifted above the crowd. We belong here. Listen to your employees. Respect is profitable. Natalie stared silently at the growing movement outside, and for the first time all day, she finally looked overwhelmed. By evening, downtown Chicago resembled the center of a political movement instead of a financial district. News vans lined the streets around Meridian Tower. Helicopters circled overhead while reporters shouted updates into microphones beneath glowing city lights. Rainwater reflected camera flashes across crowded sidewalks filled with employees, activists, analysts, and curious strangers. Nobody fully controlled the story anymore. It had become larger than Meridian Crown, larger than Natalie Carter. Inside the 48th floor boardroom, executives watched the growing crowds below with visible anxiety. Some saw inspiration. Others saw danger. Natalie stood quietly near the windows. Thousands of people filled the streets beneath her. Workers held signs. Former employees hugged strangers. People cried openly during interviews. One giant banner stretched across the crowd. We were never invisible. Richard approached slowly beside her. You changed something today, he said quietly. Natalie kept watching the streets. Maybe people were already ready to change, she replied. The boardroom television suddenly switched to breaking coverage. A major law firm in New York announced emergency diversity audits. Then another company in Atlanta. Then a banking group in Los Angeles. Executives around the table exchanged stunned looks. The reaction spread faster than anyone predicted. Natalie's assistant entered, carrying fresh reports. 3 additional corporations requested partnership meetings regarding the Meridian reforms, she announced. Daniel Mercer rubbed his temples heavily. This cannot possibly sustain long-term, he muttered. Natalie turned slowly. Why not? Daniel hesitated. Because movements burn hot emotionally before fading. Natalie studied him carefully. Pain fades slowly when millions recognize it personally. Nobody argued. The evidence existed downstairs in the streets. Employees were not protesting for entertainment. They were responding to years of accumulated silence finally cracking open. A soft knock interrupted the tension. Victoria Langford entered cautiously. The room shifted immediately. Earlier that morning, she commanded fear. Now she carried humility so visibly it altered her entire posture. No expensive coat, no performative confidence, just exhaustion. Natalie looked toward her calmly. How are you holding up? Victoria gave a weak laugh. Poorly. Honestly. The honesty felt almost shocking. Richard motioned toward an empty chair. Victoria remained standing instead. "I watched the crowd outside," she said quietly. "Some of those signs mention experiences inside my firm." Nobody responded immediately. Victoria swallowed hard. "I spent years believing successful leadership meant controlling rooms through intimidation." Her voice trembled slightly. "Now I realize people were afraid of me long before today." Natalie folded her arms thoughtfully. "Fear imitates respect very convincingly inside corporate environments." Victoria nodded slowly. "I know that now." Silence settled again, then Victoria surprised everyone. "I want to speak downstairs." Several executives looked alarmed instantly. "Absolutely not," Daniel Mercer said immediately. "The media would destroy you." Victoria turned toward him calmly. "Maybe they should." Natalie watched her carefully. The room waited. Richard finally asked quietly, "Why do you want to speak publicly tonight?" Victoria looked toward the massive crowd below. "Because hiding is what created this culture in the first place." Nobody spoke. Her answer carried uncomfortable truth. Natalie slowly approached her. "If you go downstairs," Natalie said carefully, "people will not see a villain seeking redemption." Victoria nodded. "I know. They will see someone who represented years of humiliation and exclusion." Victoria inhaled shakily. "I know that too." Natalie studied her for several long seconds, then quietly asked, "Are you prepared to listen instead of defend yourself?" Victoria answered immediately, "Yes." That single word changed something. Richard noticed it first, so did Natalie. For the first time all day, Victoria sounded less concerned about saving herself than understanding damage she helped create. The assistant's tablet buzzed again. She looked stunned. "Natalie," she whispered, "the president just commented publicly." Every head turned. "What did he say?" Richard asked. The assistant read carefully. "Corporate accountability begins when leadership values dignity as much as profit. Today's conversation matters." The room fell silent again. The situation had officially crossed into national political territory. Daniel Mercer looked horrified. "This is becoming uncontrollable." Natalie turned toward him calmly. "No," she replied softly. "It's becoming visible." Outside the tower, thunder rolled faintly beyond distant skyscrapers. Night settled across Chicago. The crowd below kept growing. Victoria looked toward the streets again, then back toward Natalie. "Will you come downstairs with me?" The question surprised everyone. Natalie hesitated briefly. She had spent years avoiding symbolic public performances, but tonight already stopped belonging solely to her. Richard watched her carefully. The room waited. Finally, Natalie nodded once. "Yes," she said quietly. The assistant immediately looked nervous. "Security will strongly advise against this." Natalie smiled faintly. "Security advised against me parking downstairs this morning too." Even Richard laughed softly at that. For the first time all day, tension cracked slightly. But as Natalie and Victoria moved toward the elevators together, nobody inside the boardroom fully understood what would happen next. Because outside Meridian Tower, thousands of people waited beneath city lights and storm clouds for something far more dangerous than scandal. They were waiting for proof that powerful people could actually change. The private elevator descended slowly through Meridian Tower. Natalie and Victoria stood side by side in complete silence, while security personnel filled the corners around them. Through the glass walls, Chicago glowed beneath wet streets and flashing emergency lights. Victoria's hands trembled slightly. She noticed Natalie standing perfectly calm beside her. "How are you not terrified right now?" Victoria asked quietly. Natalie looked ahead. "I am terrified," she answered. Victoria frowned. Natalie finally turned toward her. "Leadership is not the absence of fear. It's deciding something matters more than comfort." The elevator continued downward. Victoria absorbed the words carefully. For years she believed leadership meant domination. Natalie carried power differently. Steady, controlled, human. The lobby doors opened. Noise exploded instantly. Thousands of voices echoed through the massive marble atrium outside Meridian Tower. Protest signs pressed against barricades, while cameras flashed endlessly beneath bright floodlights. Police officers struggled maintaining clear pathways. The moment Natalie appeared, the crowd surged emotionally. Not violently, hopefully. People shouted her name, employees raised signs higher, news reporters pushed forward aggressively. Victoria froze briefly beside the entrance. The energy outside felt overwhelming, raw, emotional, uncontrolled. Natalie stepped forward first. The crowd immediately quieted slightly. Microphones extended toward her from every direction. Questions crashed together chaotically. Ms. Carter, will more executives lose positions? Do you believe systemic discrimination defines corporate America? Is Meridian launching national investigations? Natalie raised one hand gently. Remarkably, thousands quieted almost immediately. Rain dripped steadily from umbrellas and traffic lights, reflected across wet pavement. Natalie looked across the enormous crowd slowly, faces everywhere, young professionals, older workers, former employees, people carrying years of invisible frustration. Today began with humiliation, Natalie said calmly into the microphones. The crowd listened silently. But humiliation alone cannot build anything better. Cameras flashed continuously. Victoria stood several steps behind Natalie, looking overwhelmed by the sea of faces watching them. Natalie continued. Millions of people recognized themselves in this morning's footage because exclusion has become normalized inside too many workplaces. Murmurs spread through the crowd. People nodded, some cried quietly. This movement cannot become about destroying individuals, Natalie said firmly, because systems survive when we pretend only monsters create harm. Victoria lowered her eyes. Natalie turned toward her slowly. The crowd immediately noticed. Cameras shifted direction instantly. Natalie extended one hand gently toward Victoria. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. Victoria hesitated, then slowly stepped beside her. Thousands watched silently now. Victoria faced the crowd. Her voice nearly failed at first. This morning, she whispered, I publicly humiliated Natalie Carter because I believed appearance determined authority. The crowd remained quiet. No shouting, no cheering, only listening. Victoria inhaled shakily. I convinced myself for years that aggressive behavior made me strong. Really, it made me cruel. Several cameras zoomed closer. Her face looked exhausted beneath the city lights. Real, unprotected. Some of you watching have probably experienced people like me before, Victoria continued quietly. Managers, executives, partners, people who made you feel smaller so they could feel secure. The crowd stirred emotionally. A woman near the front began crying openly. Victoria noticed, and something inside her visibly broke. I am sorry, she whispered. Not performative, not polished, genuine. The silence afterward felt enormous. Natalie watched carefully beside her. Then someone inside the crowd shouted, Do better then. Others joined immediately. Do better. Change it. Listen to employees. The chant spread rapidly through the streets, not hateful, demanding, hopeful. Victoria looked stunned. They were not asking for her destruction. They were demanding transformation. Natalie stepped forward again. That is exactly what begins tonight, she announced. Cheers erupted. Television cameras captured every second live nationwide. Meridian Crown will fund independent workplace accountability programs across every partner organization beginning immediately. Applause thundered across the streets. Leadership should never depend on humiliation, Natalie continued powerfully, and dignity should never depend on permission. The crowd roared louder. Richard Holloway watched from the lobby entrance quietly. Even he looked stunned now. Because this no longer resembled corporate crisis management, it resembled social transformation. Then suddenly a voice near the barricades shouted something unexpected. Natalie! The crowd shifted. A teenage girl stood near the front holding an umbrella. Dark hair, red eyes from crying. Victoria froze instantly. Emma, she whispered. Her daughter stared at her through the rain. The entire crowd fell silent again. Emma's voice trembled. Mum, she called softly, come home. Victoria completely broke. Tears streamed openly down her face now. Natalie stepped backward quietly, giving space without drawing attention to the gesture. Emma looked directly at her mother. "I don't care about your job," she cried. "I just want you to stop becoming someone angry all the time." Nobody in the crowd moved. Nobody even lifted signs anymore. Because suddenly, this stopped being about corporations entirely. Now it was simply about a daughter begging her mother to become human again. Rain continued falling softly across Chicago, but nobody noticed anymore. The streets surrounding Meridian Tower stood completely silent while Victoria Langford stared at her daughter through flashing cameras and trembling city lights. Emma looked terrified, not of the crowd, not of reporters, of losing her mother completely. Victoria covered her mouth with shaking hands. Years of controlled composure collapsed openly beneath national television cameras. "Emma," she whispered. Her daughter pushed carefully through the barricades while security officers stepped aside instinctively. Nobody stopped her. Some moments mattered more than protocol. Emma reached her mother slowly. Victoria dropped to her knees immediately. The crowd watched in absolute silence. "I'm sorry," Victoria cried. "I'm so sorry." Emma hugged her tightly. Years of distance seemed to collapse inside that embrace. Natalie stood quietly several feet away. The city lights reflected softly across her face, while reporters lowered microphones for the first time all evening. Nobody wanted to interrupt the moment. Richard Holloway stepped beside Natalie. "You knew this could happen," he murmured. Natalie shook her head gently. "No," she answered quietly. "I only hoped people might remember they were human underneath their titles." Emma finally looked up toward Natalie. Her voice trembled. "Thank you," she whispered. Natalie seemed genuinely uncomfortable, receiving gratitude. "Your mother made her own choices tonight," she replied softly. Victoria slowly stood again beside Emma. Mascara streaked her face. Her expensive appearance no longer mattered. For the first time all day, she looked real. One reporter cautiously stepped forward. "Ms. Langford," he asked carefully, "what happens next for you now?" Victoria looked toward the massive crowd surrounding Meridian Tower, then toward Emma, finally toward Natalie. "I learn how to listen," she answered quietly. The simplicity of the response stunned people. No excuses, no legal language, no strategic positioning, just honesty. The crowd slowly began applauding. Not loudly, not triumphantly, something gentler. Recognition. Hope. Natalie stepped toward the microphones once more. "Tonight should remind every company in America about something important," she said. The applause faded immediately. Workplace culture does not stay inside offices. People listened carefully. It follows people home, into marriages, into families, into children's lives. Emma squeezed her mother's hand tightly. Natalie continued calmly. "When environments reward cruelty, people eventually forget who they were before survival became performance." The words settled heavily across the streets. Thousands understood them personally. Natalie looked toward the skyscrapers surrounding downtown Chicago. Countless office windows glowed against the storm-dark sky. "America built extraordinary industries," she said softly. "But too often we built them by convincing people dignity was weakness and exhaustion meant success." Several employees inside the crowd wiped away tears quietly. Natalie's voice remained steady. "That ends now." The crowd erupted. Cheers echoed through the financial district. Car horns sounded blocks away. Television commentators spoke excitedly into cameras. But Natalie raised one hand again. The streets gradually quieted. "Real change will require more than speeches," she warned. The crowd listened. "It requires courage from employees willing to speak honestly and leaders willing to hear uncomfortable truths without punishment." Richard watched her carefully. Even after building a multi-billion-dollar empire, Natalie still spoke like someone carrying old scars beneath polished success. Then another voice called from the crowd. An older black man wearing a maintenance uniform stepped forward slowly. "Ms. Carter," he shouted, "I worked 30 years downtown. Tonight is the first time somebody powerful ever admitted what workers actually go through." The crowd applauded loudly again. Natalie's expression softened. "What's your name?" she asked. "Leon," he answered proudly. Natalie nodded once. "Thank you for surviving long enough to see this moment, Leon." The man covered his face briefly, emotional. Around him, strangers hugged each other, not because everything was fixed, because somebody finally acknowledged the truth publicly. Victoria watched the crowd carefully. For years, she considered emotional vulnerability weakness. Now she realized suppressed pain had been surrounding her entire career. She simply refused to see it. Emma quietly leaned against her side. "Mum," she whispered softly, "you sound different tonight." Victoria looked down at her daughter. "I feel different," she admitted. Natalie overheard the exchange. A faint smile crossed her face. Then Richard's phone rang sharply. He answered immediately. His expression changed fast. Very fast. Natalie noticed instantly. "What happened?" Richard lowered the phone slowly. The noise around them suddenly felt distant. The Securities Commission announced emergency investigations into 6 major corporations connected to discrimination allegations tonight. Several reporters gasped loudly. Victoria's face paled again. Richard continued carefully. 2 CEOs already resigned publicly within the last 10 minutes. The movement was accelerating beyond anyone's control now. Natalie looked toward the towering skyline surrounding them. Inside hundreds of glowing offices across America, executives were probably deleting emails, calling lawyers, preparing statements, or finally confronting themselves honestly for the first time. And deep down, Natalie understood something dangerous. Tonight was only the beginning. Midnight approached slowly over Chicago. But nobody inside Meridian Tower considered going home. The city outside pulsed with flashing emergency lights, television crews, and endless conversations spilling through crowded sidewalks and late-night diners. Social media feeds moved faster than financial markets. Corporate America was trembling. Inside the executive floors of Meridian Crown, conference rooms remained lit across every level. Lawyers reviewed compliance documents while analysts tracked collapsing stock values tied to companies suddenly exposed publicly. But inside Natalie's private office, silence finally existed. She stood alone near the windows overlooking Lake Michigan. The storm had passed. Clouds drifted slowly apart above the sleeping city. Her reflection stared back from the glass. Tired. Older somehow. A soft knock interrupted the quiet. "Come in," Natalie said softly. Victoria entered carefully. No makeup remained. No jewelry, no armor. She looked like someone surviving emotional surgery. Natalie motioned toward the chairs beside the fireplace. Victoria sat slowly. For several moments neither woman spoke. The silence felt strangely peaceful after the chaos downstairs. Finally, Victoria looked up. "Why didn't you destroy me?" Natalie almost smiled sadly. "You keep asking that question." "Because I deserve it." Natalie shook her head gently. "No," Victoria frowned. "No," Natalie folded her hands quietly. "Destruction is easy. Transformation is difficult." Victoria stared toward the floor. "You really believe people change?" Natalie looked toward the skyline again. "I have to believe it," she answered softly. "Otherwise, everything becomes hopeless." The room fell silent once more. Victoria finally whispered something unexpected. "My father used to say, 'Weakness invites humiliation.'" Natalie looked toward her carefully. Victoria laughed bitterly. "He built himself from nothing after Vietnam, worked brutal hours, never trusted anyone." The pieces began connecting quietly. "He taught me survival meant dominance," Victoria continued. "Every room became competition. Every interaction became hierarchy." Natalie listened without interruption. "When I entered corporate law," Victoria admitted, "the culture rewarded exactly those instincts: aggression, detachment, winning at any cost." Her eyes filled slowly. "I stopped noticing who I was becoming because success kept validating it." Natalie nodded once. "Systems normalize behavior until cruelty feels professional." Victoria looked exhausted. Emma noticed before I did. The sentence carried enormous grief. Natalie quietly remembered her own childhood. Detroit. Her father working double factory shifts before the recession destroyed everything. Her mother balancing unpaid bills at the kitchen table. Fear shaped people differently depending on what survival demanded. Victoria suddenly looked toward Natalie. "What made you different?" Natalie hesitated, then answered honestly. "Pain." Victoria remained silent. Natalie continued softly. "When people underestimate you long enough, eventually you choose one of 2 paths." Chicago's skyline shimmered faintly beyond the windows. "Either you become hardened by humiliation," Natalie said quietly, Or you decide nobody else should experience it if you ever gain power yourself. Victoria lowered her eyes again. And I became the first kind. Natalie did not disagree. A notification suddenly appeared across the television mounted silently on the wall. Breaking news. Federal investigations expanding nationwide. Richard Holloway entered immediately afterward without knocking. His expression looked grim. "Natalie," he said carefully, "we have another problem." Victoria immediately stiffened. Natalie remained calm. "What happened?" Richard handed over a tablet. A confidential internal document filled the screen. Meridian Crown Financial, Diversity Risk Assessments. Natalie's expression changed instantly. Where did this come from? Richard exhaled heavily. Anonymous leak. Victoria looked confused. Natalie scrolled silently through the files. Her face slowly hardened. Richard spoke carefully. The documents suggest Meridian knew about discriminatory patterns internally much earlier than publicly acknowledged. Silence filled the office. Cold, dangerous. Victoria stared at Natalie. "Is it true?" Natalie kept reading. Page after page, old reports. Internal warnings, suppressed recommendations. Richard finally answered quietly. "Partially." Natalie closed the tablet slowly. For the first time all day, uncertainty crossed her face. Victoria watched carefully. "You knew more than you admitted publicly," she realized. Natalie remained silent. Richard spoke again. Previous leadership blocked reforms repeatedly before Natalie gained controlling authority. But the explanation sounded incomplete now. Outside, helicopters still circled downtown. News alerts exploded across social media again. Critics immediately seized the narrative. Meridian exposed hypocrisy inside reform movement. Did Natalie Carter wait too long? Victoria slowly leaned back. The entire situation shifted suddenly. Natalie looked toward the dark skyline quietly, then whispered something almost to herself. "Truth becomes dangerous once it belongs to everyone." Richard studied her carefully. "What do we do now?" Natalie turned slowly from the windows. Her expression looked different, less controlled, more human. "The same thing we demanded from everyone else," she answered quietly. Victoria frowned slightly. Natalie met both their eyes directly. "We tell the whole truth." And somewhere deep inside Meridian Crown Financial, people who once viewed Natalie Carter as untouchable suddenly realized something shocking. Even the woman leading the movement carried secrets capable of destroying everything. By 2 a.m., the atmosphere inside Meridian Tower had changed completely. The confidence driving the movement hours earlier now mixed with uncertainty and suspicion. Television networks replayed leaked Meridian documents beside clips from Natalie's interview. Commentators debated whether reform itself had become another carefully managed corporate strategy. Outside the tower, some protesters remained. Others argued among themselves. Trust shifted dangerously. Inside the executive conference room, Natalie sat alone reviewing old internal reports spread across the table. Dates, warnings, ignored recommendations. Evidence that Meridian Crown's problems stretched deeper into the past than she admitted publicly. Richard Holloway entered quietly, carrying fresh coffee. Neither looked rested anymore. "Media advisors recommend delaying further statements until morning," he said carefully. Natalie barely glanced up. "Of course they do," Richard sighed. "Natalie, this leak changes everything." She nodded slowly. "It should." Richard frowned. "You understand people will accuse you of hypocrisy now." Natalie finally looked at him directly. "Maybe they should." The honesty unsettled him. Natalie leaned back heavily in her chair. For the first time all day, exhaustion showed openly. "I inherited part of this system before I controlled enough authority to change it," she said quietly. "But I still benefited from surviving inside it while others disappeared quietly." Richard remained silent, because part of him knew she was right. Natalie picked up one particular report, a complaint filed 4 years earlier. An analyst named Renee Jackson describing racial exclusion inside executive development programs. The recommendations section remained marked unresolved. Natalie stared at the page. "I remember this case," she whispered. Richard looked uncomfortable. "The previous board buried it." Natalie nodded slowly. And I accepted compromise because I thought gradual reform would eventually work. Her voice hardened slightly. Meanwhile, people kept suffering while executives debated timing and optics. Outside the room, phones continued ringing non-stop across Meridian headquarters. The movement had reached dangerous territory now. Not because critics attacked Natalie, because they were partially right. Victoria entered carefully moments later. She carried another stack of printed news reports. "You should see this," she said quietly. Natalie accepted the papers. Headlines covered the pages. Reform leader accused of delaying action. Did Meridian ignore its own warnings? Insiders questioned timeline of corporate changes. Natalie read silently, then placed the reports aside calmly. Victoria watched her carefully. "You're taking this surprisingly well," she admitted. Natalie almost laughed. "No, I'm simply familiar with disappointment." The room fell quiet again. Victoria studied her closely. "You're blaming yourself for not moving faster." Natalie looked toward the windows. Chicago shimmered beneath midnight fog now. "Leadership delays always cost someone else first," she answered softly. Richard rubbed his forehead heavily. "The board wants emergency damage control immediately." Natalie shook her head. "No damage control." Richard exhaled sharply. "Natalie," she interrupted quietly, "we demanded honesty from everyone else today. We don't lose credibility by telling the truth now. We lose credibility if we suddenly start behaving like every other corporation protecting itself." Victoria slowly nodded. The logic felt painfully consistent. Natalie stood and walked toward the windows again. "Do you know why this movement spread so fast?" she asked softly. Nobody answered. "Because people are starving for honesty from powerful institutions." Lightning flickered faintly beyond distant clouds. Natalie continued, "The moment we manipulate truth for convenience, everything collapses into performance again." Richard looked exhausted. "Then what exactly do you propose?" Natalie turned back slowly. "A press conference before markets open." Victoria blinked. "At dawn?" Natalie nodded once. "Full disclosure, internal failures, delayed reforms, board resistance. Everything." Richard looked stunned. "That could trigger investigations into Meridian directly." "Good," Natalie replied. Silence. Heavy silence. Victoria stared at her almost incredulously. "You would risk your entire company." Natalie answered immediately. "If reform only survives while protecting powerful people, then it was never reform at all." The words settled across the room like judgment. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Then Victoria quietly asked something unexpected. "Why are you really doing this?" Natalie looked toward her carefully. "Because 20 years ago, my father lost everything after executives decided workers were disposable numbers during restructuring." Richard lowered his eyes. He had heard portions of the story before. Never like this. "After the factory closed," Natalie continued softly, "he spent months pretending everything would recover while quietly breaking apart inside." Her voice tightened slightly. "One night he told me something I never forgot." The room remained perfectly silent. "He said the most dangerous people in America wear expensive suits while convincing themselves human damage is just necessary business." Victoria looked shaken. Natalie inhaled slowly. "I built Meridian because I wanted power badly enough to stop those systems someday." Then she looked directly at both of them. "But power changes people slowly if they aren't careful." Nobody moved, because suddenly the room understood something terrifying. Natalie Carter was not presenting herself as a flawless hero anymore. She was admitting how close even she came to becoming part of the machine she wanted to dismantle. Then her assistant burst into the room, pale-faced. "Natalie," she said urgently, "federal investigators just arrived downstairs." The room went completely still. The movement had finally reached its next stage. And now, the people demanding accountability would have to survive it themselves. Dawn approached Chicago beneath heavy gray clouds. The city looked exhausted, so did everyone inside Meridian Tower. Federal investigators entered the building shortly after 4:00 a.m., carrying sealed folders and expressionless faces. Security escorted them upstairs while reporters gathered outside the lobby doors like wolves sensing blood. News alerts exploded instantly. Federal Review launched into Meridian Crown. Accountability movement faces first major test. Inside the executive conference room, nobody touched the untouched breakfast trays lining the walls. Coffee had replaced sleep hours ago. Natalie stood calmly near the head of the table while investigators organized documents across polished wood surfaces. Victoria watched silently from the corner. She understood the irony immediately. The woman who ignited a national accountability movement now faced accountability herself. Lead investigator Harold Bennett adjusted his glasses carefully. "Ms. Carter," he began formally, "we are reviewing whether Meridian Crown knowingly delayed corrective action after receiving documented internal discrimination complaints." Natalie nodded once. Understood. The simplicity of her answer unsettled several executives. No defensive language, no corporate maneuvering. Richard Holloway sat rigidly beside the windows. Even he looked uncertain now. Investigator Bennett opened one file slowly. These reports indicate recommendations for mandatory oversight programs existed internally at Meridian nearly 3 years earlier than publicly disclosed yesterday. Natalie remained standing. Correct. The room stiffened. Several attorneys looked horrified. Victoria stared toward Natalie carefully. Most executives would never admit that immediately. Bennett continued, "Why were those reforms delayed?" Silence settled briefly. Natalie finally answered quietly, "Because I compromised." The room went still. Even the investigators looked surprised by the honesty. Natalie folded her hands. "I convinced myself gradual change would create less resistance internally." Rain began falling again softly against the windows. Chicago disappeared beneath fog once more. Meanwhile, employees continued experiencing the same harm while leadership debated financial risk. Natalie continued. Richard lowered his eyes. He remembered those meetings, the endless calculations, public relations concerns, investor reactions, always later, always eventually. Investigator Bennett watched Natalie carefully. "And you now believe that was wrong?" Natalie's answer came immediately. "Yes." No hesitation, no conditions. Victoria slowly sat down. Something about the moment affected her deeply. Because Natalie was doing something almost unheard of among powerful executives, accepting responsibility without protecting herself first. One board member suddenly spoke sharply. "Natalie, careful." She turned toward him calmly. "Why?" The executive looked stunned. "Because these statements carry legal consequences." Natalie nodded. "They should." Nobody answered. Outside the conference room, reporters continued gathering by the hundreds. Markets would open within hours. Nobody knew what would survive the morning. Investigator Bennett closed one folder slowly. "Ms. Carter, most corporate leaders fight aggressively against this level of scrutiny." Natalie looked toward the skyline. "That's why systems rarely change." Victoria watched her carefully, then quietly spoke for the first time since investigators arrived. "She's telling the truth." The room turned toward her. Victoria inhaled slowly. "Yesterday morning, I publicly humiliated Natalie Carter because I believed status protected people from consequences." Her voice remained steady now. "But if accountability only applies to weaker people, then none of this means anything." The investigators exchanged quick glances. Richard almost smiled despite the tension. Victoria continued. "The culture that shaped me also shaped every compromise discussed inside these boardrooms. Fear of instability, fear of investors, fear of losing power." She looked directly toward Natalie. "The difference is she finally chose honesty before self-preservation." Silence followed, heavy, real. Then another executive quietly cleared his throat, an older man named Stephen Walsh, 30 years inside corporate finance. "I opposed the reforms originally," he admitted slowly. Everyone looked toward him. Walsh removed his glasses tiredly. "Not because I thought they were wrong, because I feared disruption." Another silence. Then unexpectedly, Daniel Mercer spoke too. "Me too." One by one, executives around the room slowly acknowledged versions of the same truth. Delay, fear, compromise, protection of systems over people. The atmosphere changed quietly. This no longer resembled an investigation alone, it resembled confession. Investigator Bennett finally leaned back. "Interesting, Ade," he murmured. Natalie frowned slightly. What is? Bennett looked around the room. In 22 years investigating corporate misconduct, I've never seen executives voluntarily admit systemic responsibility without immunity agreements first. Nobody responded, because nobody knew how to explain what was happening either. Outside, the first light of dawn slowly spread across Chicago. Fog drifted between skyscrapers while television crews prepared for opening market coverage. Natalie's assistant entered carefully. The press conference stage is ready downstairs, she said softly. Richard checked the time. Markets open in 40 minutes. Natalie nodded slowly, then looked toward the investigators. Will Meridian face penalties? Bennett answered honestly. Probably. Natalie accepted that immediately. Good. The answer stunned several people again. But Victoria understood now. Punishment no longer frightened Natalie Carter as much as dishonesty did. Natalie moved toward the door quietly, then paused. Without turning around, she spoke softly enough that everyone listened carefully. Yesterday began with a woman deciding who belonged in a parking garage. Silence filled the room. Today ends with powerful people finally admitting how many others they excluded while protecting themselves. She turned back slowly. That truth cost something. Nobody disagreed. Then Natalie Carter walked toward the largest press conference of her life, not knowing whether the movement she started would survive the next hour, or whether she would. The ballroom inside Meridian Tower overflowed before sunrise. Reporters packed every aisle while camera lights burned across the massive stage prepared overnight. Financial analysts filled the back rows beside activists, employees, politicians, and exhausted executives who looked like survivors after a natural disaster. Outside, Chicago awakened beneath cold rain and gray skies. Inside, America waited. Natalie Carter stood alone behind the curtain moments before the press conference began. No advisors surrounded her now. No lawyers whispered strategy. Only silence. Victoria approached quietly from the hallway. She carried 2 coffee cups. You forgot breakfast again, she said softly. Natalie accepted the cup with a faint smile. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. The strange friendship forming between them still felt impossible. Then Victoria asked the question haunting everyone. What if this destroys Meridian? Natalie stared toward the bright stage lights beyond the curtain. Then maybe something more honest replaces it, she answered quietly. Victoria shook her head slightly. Most people with your power would protect themselves first. Natalie finally looked toward her. That's exactly why systems stay broken. The stage manager signaled urgently. It was time. Natalie walked forward alone. The ballroom exploded with flashing cameras immediately. Hundreds of journalists stood simultaneously. Questions crashed together chaotically. Natalie raised one hand gently. Silence slowly spread. Behind her, giant digital screens displayed only 3 words. Truth requires cost. Natalie stepped to the microphone. Her face looked exhausted, human, real. Yesterday morning, she began quietly, millions watched a woman decide I did not belong in executive parking because of how I looked. The room remained perfectly silent. Last night, millions discovered Meridian Crown delayed reforms internally because powerful people feared disruption more than injustice. Several executives in attendance lowered their eyes. Natalie continued, both truths matter equally. Camera shutters echoed endlessly. This movement cannot survive if accountability only applies to obvious villains, while institutions protecting silence escape scrutiny. Across the ballroom, reporters typed furiously. Natalie folded her hands calmly. So today, Meridian Crown Financial accepts full federal cooperation regarding every internal investigation connected to discrimination complaints and delayed reforms. Gasps spread instantly. Stocks would collapse after this. Everyone knew it. Natalie kept speaking anyway. Effective immediately, executive compensation across Meridian leadership is suspended pending independent review, including my own. Richard Holloway closed his eyes briefly. Even he had not expected that. Additionally, Natalie continued, Meridian will establish a permanent employee oversight council with direct authority independent from executive leadership. The room remained stunned. This was not damage control. This was surrendering power publicly. Natalie's voice softened slightly. Yesterday, people called me courageous for confronting discrimination in a parking garage. She paused. But real courage means applying accountability even when it threatens your own success. Nobody moved. Nobody even coughed. The ballroom felt suspended in time. Natalie looked directly into the cameras. For years, corporate America trained leaders to believe protecting institutions mattered more than protecting people. Outside, thunder rolled faintly above Chicago. That philosophy created extraordinary profits, Natalie admitted quietly, and extraordinary loneliness. Burnout, fear, humiliation. Victoria watched from backstage, silently crying. Emma stood beside her, holding her hand tightly. Natalie continued, "Systems only change when powerful people finally risk losing something themselves." A reporter suddenly shouted, "Ms. Carter, are you resigning?" The room exploded with murmurs. Natalie considered carefully, then answered honestly, "If independent review determines my failures disqualify me from leadership, then yes." Shock spread visibly. Nobody expected that answer either. Natalie inhaled slowly. Leadership is not ownership, it is responsibility. Silence settled again. Then, unexpectedly, someone in the back of the ballroom started applauding softly. A maintenance worker. Then another employee joined. Then another. The applause spread gradually across the room. Not celebratory, respectful, emotional. Because people recognized how rare honesty looked when power finally stopped hiding behind polished language. Natalie stepped away from the microphone briefly, then returned for one final statement. Yesterday, this story began with exclusion. Her eyes moved slowly across the crowd. Today, it ends with a simple truth. Chicago's morning light slowly brightened through the ballroom windows behind her. Every person deserves dignity before they prove their value to powerful people. The standing ovation lasted nearly 2 full minutes. Some executives remained seated, most did not. Victoria cried openly backstage while Emma hugged her tightly. Richard Holloway stared toward Natalie with quiet disbelief. Federal investigators watched silently from the side walls. Outside Meridian Tower, thousands gathered beneath umbrellas, listening through giant outdoor speakers. Many cried. Many simply stood silently. Because something unusual had happened inside corporate America. Not perfection, not revolution, something rarer. Power telling the truth about itself publicly. 6 months later, independent oversight councils operated inside hundreds of companies nationwide. Corporate accountability standards became mandatory across major financial networks. Employee retention improved dramatically. Discrimination complaints decreased. Leadership training changed permanently. Victoria Langford completed Meridian's rehabilitation program and eventually helped design national workplace reform systems beside former employees she once would have ignored completely. Emma visited her office proudly now. And Natalie Carter? She survived the investigations. Not untouched, not unchanged, but respected differently afterward. Because people no longer saw merely a successful executive. They saw someone willing to risk power rather than protect illusion. Long after the headlines faded, employees across America still remembered the image that changed everything. A woman stepping from an ordinary Honda Accord into a parking garage full of people convinced they understood exactly who belonged there. And proving them all wrong. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this video.